Good afternoon, students. Welcome to the fourth video lecture for our summer session. This lecture will cover interview number 4 in your reading. The main idea behind interview number 4, I think, is quite simple, even though I don't think that ISA presents it as simply as it could be presented. So I'll try to present the main idea fairly simply, and then we'll look at the details as well. Here's the main idea. The data, and we'll talk about the relevant data, the data shows, according to ISA, that we live in a universe that is saturated with value, with goodness, badness, rightness, wrongness, beauty, ugly, courage, wickedness, desire. All of these things are value terms that pick out value features of the universe. So the major claim here is that once we attend to the relevant data, we'll see that our universe is a value-saturated universe. It's not a universe of valueless facts, whatever that might mean. The facts point to values, the values point to facts. They're all tangled together. You can't separate out the facts and the values. All of our experiences, and of course ICE is going to talk about 4 levels of experience, all of our experiences, personal, interpersonal, and so on, scream to us that we are surrounded by value. We're just as surrounded by value as we're surrounded by air and atoms and whatnot. So the major point of the interview is simply to wake up our minds to what we really know anyway. The data speaks for itself, and it is, according to ISA, undeniable. But we try to deny the data with various theories, like moral relativism. So moral relativism, according to ISA, ignores the obvious, the immediately given. Moral relativism on this construal is both unscientific and blind, and then moral absolutism is scientific and based on a refusal to ignore the obvious. It's scientific in a broad sense of science, a more sort of historically accurate sense of science. At this point, it's really important for me to explain sort of what we're doing here. In this class, we're not going to be focusing on particular moral claims. So we're not going to be evaluating the claim that abortion is morally wrong, or abortion is morally permissible, or homosexual sex is morally wrong, or homosexual sex is morally permissible. We're not going to be looking at those sort of concrete or particular specific moral claims in our course. What we're doing is we're asking, how should we think about moral claims in general? So we're sort of doing a kind of meta-analysis where we all recognize that we make moral claims, moral evaluations, moral judgments. We distinguish between morally good persons, morally bad persons, morally good actions, morally bad actions, morally good institutions, morally bad institutions, and so on. We make those, but we want to know, what is it that we're doing? Are we describing the universe in some way? Or are we just merely giving voice to preferences, tastes, desires, and so forth? Do those kinds of claims have a kind of objectivity, as we talked about last time? Or are they merely subjective opinion? So we're looking at morality itself. So the debate between moral absolutism and moral relativism is a debate on the status of morality. Is morality about facts? Is morality about the universe, or is it merely about our own desires? That's what we're doing in this class. So, for example, this is a really important point here. You can be a moral absolutist and think abortion is wrong. And you can be a moral absolutist and think abortion is okay, that it's morally permissible. So moral absolutism is a general idea, general theory of the world, but it's not telling us particular facts about the world, right? It's telling us that there really is such a thing as morality. There are moral facts, moral laws, moral rules that exist independently of us, and our goal is to try to discover what they are. They're not based on our own psychological states. Our goal is to try to discover them in the same way there are physical facts, chemical facts, biological facts, principles, rules, and our goal is to discover those, not invent them. The pro-lifer and the pro-choicer can both be moral absolutists. What's going on here is they disagree about the moral facts. And if they're conscientious and they're reflective, then they're going to try to listen to the other side and discern what the facts are. What is the truth about abortion or about homosexual sexual activity and so on and so forth? That's the goal. If you're a moral relativist, we'll talk about this later, but if you're a moral relativist, there's no sense really in arguing or in trying to discern the facts about abortion or homosexual sexual activity. All you do is consult your own preferences and desires, or the preferences and desires of the culture to which you belong, and that tells you everything you need to know about abortion or homosexuality. There's no fact of the matter above the particular desires, preferences, tastes of yourself or the community that you belong to. So our goal here is to discover whether or not moral absolutism or moral relativism is false, or which one of them is false. Another point to make at this stage here, as you're getting more and more into this book, is I want you to pay attention to the way that Isa and Libby dialogue with one another. A lot of the students in the regular class find it startling. They're sort of taken aback by Isa's rhetoric and the way he speaks to Libby, or maybe sometimes Libby's rhetoric and the way she speaks to Isa. And I want you to think about why the author, why these dialogues have that type of flavor. Is there something that the authors, there's something that our dialogue partners, Isa and Libby, are actually revealing about morality itself in the way that they engage each other, sometimes in rude and abusive ways. Okay, let's get into the details of interview number 4. So Isa begins by talking about science. I teach a class here at Huntington University called Religious and Scientific Thought. I basically just call it Science and Religion. If you're interested in this stuff, I highly encourage you to take it. Lots of students have taken it here, and I think most of them enjoy it. But one of the things that we do during the first week or so is talk about how science actually rests on philosophical assumptions. It's a fascinating fact of history that science as we know it today arose in a particular milieu. It arose in a particular environment. It didn't arise all over the world, right? It arose in a particular intellectual, religious, political, economic environment, and that environment appears to be conducive to science and other environments don't. And so interesting historical questions are why? Why did that happen? Well, here's some things that science assumes about the universe, but itself cannot scientifically prove. You can't use science in order to demonstrate these things. So here are 4 quick things that science assumes that are philosophical in nature. Science assumes that reality is rational and intelligible. So science presupposes that the subject matter it's investigating is open to, or is itself rational and intelligible. The world, the universe itself is rational and intelligible. Science assumes B, that humans can know or discern the rationality and intelligibility of the universe. Okay, so A says science assumes that reality itself is rational and intelligible, but you could have reality being rational and intelligible, and it's just so complicated that our minds are unfit to grasp the rationality and intelligibility of the universe. So reality could be rational and intelligible, and we never discover that because our minds are not sophisticated enough to do so. If we believed that, then engaging in scientific practice would be futile. But science presupposes not only that reality is intelligible and rational, but it presupposes B, that humans, our minds, can know and discern the rationality and intelligibility of the universe. There's a kind of match, there's a fit between our minds and the universe. This is remarkable, by the way. There's a very, very fascinating argument that's been developed by the philosopher physicist Robin Collins. If you're interested in this, Google Robin Collins, and it'll take you to his webpage, and he's got lots of fascinating arguments here. So he argues that the fact that we humans can know the rationality and intelligibility of the universe, that our minds fit the universe in this really fascinating and wonderful, beautiful way, he argues that this is reason to believe that God exists. Science assumes C, that good reasons need to be given for what we believe, for our conclusions, right? So you make a scientific assertion or you formulate a scientific hypothesis, and then you got to present some reasons for it. And we do this even outside of science, strictly so-called. So, for example, my wife may want to go work out, and I may want to go to a movie. And my wife may ask why. Why should we go to a movie rather than work out? She may give me some reasons for preferring working out over a movie. I may give her reasons for thinking that a movie is better than working out. Right? We often require good reasons for what we believe. Now, those good reasons can take many different forms. They can be empirical, like we have in biology or chemistry or physics, but there can be also non-empirical reasons. So, for example, the Pythagorean theorem. We have good reason to believe that the Pythagorean theorem properly describes Euclidean triangles. What are our reasons? Well, we give a proof, a geometric proof. That's not an empirical proof. How about abortion is morally wrong? There might be some empirical data that is relevant to that claim. So, for example, we might show that pretty much every embryological textbook over the last 50 years has demonstrated that the human being comes into existence as soon as fertilization occurs. When the sperm meets the egg, you get a new organism called a human being, and that's relevant to the debate. But there's also moral or philosophical insight required. So, for example, the claim that it is always wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being or a vulnerable human being. Since the zygote or the conceptus is an innocent or vulnerable human being, the argument would go, therefore, abortion is morally wrong. So we've got some moral insight or philosophical insight, mathematical insight, logical insight, and so on and so forth. Not just empirical data. There's all sorts of other data. In fact, empirical data rests on this other data. Lastly, science assumes that good theories depend on the data and not the other way around. In other words, we want to gather data and then formulate our theory on the basis of the data. We don't want to formulate our theory and then only pick data that is relevant to our theory. Right? This is terrible. So, for example, you can think of politicians are often accused of this, right? They've got some idea. Ideologues are accused of this, right? The Nazis. Here's a fascinating historical example. There's a book by the famous paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould. He was a Harvard paleontologist and evolutionary advocate, and he's got a book called The Mismeasure of Man. I highly recommend you read it. It's a page turner. And in The Mismeasure of Man, Gould talks about two very, very famous, well-respected scientists in the United States and in Europe. And they were arguing on the basis of data, on the basis of evidence that they had collected. They were arguing that we can show that certain races are superior intellectually and morally than other races. And what they did is they gathered skulls of the different races. So they gathered skulls of Caucasians, they gathered skulls of Native persons, they gathered skulls of Africans, they gathered skulls of Asians, they gathered skulls of Jews, and they set them side by side. And they argued that the skulls, unsurprisingly, of the Caucasians are larger than the skulls of these other groups, and they ranked them in some sort of hierarchy of intellectual and moral prowess or ability. What Stephen Jay Gould demonstrates or shows in this book, and he's just recounting history here, other people did this in real time, was that they cherry-picked their data. So, for example, they chose the largest skulls of the Caucasians and some of the smallest skulls of the Africans. They chose male skulls of Caucasians and female and child skulls of Asians, Africans, Jews, and Native persons. I laugh because, it's tragically, historically. Of course, it's for my people, for your people, for all peoples, this is tragic. But when we look at it, in hindsight, it shows sort of ideology doing all of the work. It's determining which data is relevant. So what does this suggest? This suggests that gathering data itself is a philosophically laden enterprise. Right? Science can't be divorced from philosophical principles. Theological principles are relevant for science. So science assumes those four things. None of those four things are themselves demonstrable from science. Science rests on these philosophical beliefs. Now, we have good reasons for embracing those philosophical beliefs that are independent of the science, but those reasons are not scientific reasons. They're philosophical, rational, logical, mathematical reasons. So what we discover here then is that empirical data is not the only sort of data. So think about those four assumptions we just talked about. None of those are empirical. But nevertheless, they're relevant for the gathering of empirical data. So there's more data than just the empirical data. By empirical data, I mean the data that is available to the senses. So empiricism, empirical, means discoverable by the senses, right? By seeing it, hearing it, tasting it, touching it, smelling it. So there's more data than the data of the senses. That's definitely one of the lessons of the allegory of the cave. Right, in the allegory of the cave, Socrates wants to say, look, you can gather evidence from your senses, but go beyond that. Right? Go beyond the sensory data. One of my favorite philosophers, Soren Kierkegaard, argues that persons who are stuck in the sensory data world are really just like mosquitoes, fish, and beasts. They just want their senses to be stimulated and never move beyond that into a more human-like existence. So there's more data than just empirical data. Internal data, data of experience, the data of our conscience, the data of insight, mathematical insight, logical insight, philosophical insight, and so on and so forth. So philosophy has data. It's not data-less. We're not just pulling our beards, even though you see me pulling my beard all the time. We're not just sitting around pulling our beards, making stuff up, right? We subject these ideas to critical scrutiny, just like we're doing with this debate between moral absolutism and moral relativism. Let's look now at the four levels of moral experience. So in your notes, you might write data of moral experience. We have four levels: personal experience, interpersonal experience, moral language and discourse, and human history. So let's look at the first level of the data of moral experience, personal moral experience. This is going to be private data. It's personal, right? It's based on reflection on my own experiences. And so I experience things like goodness, rightness, ought, desire, guilt, shame. I experience these things, and that's part of the data, right? It's relevant to understanding the universe. We have to include that. So we experience things as being desired. I desire something, and we also experience things as being desirable. Here's a case in point. I desire chocolate cheesecake, but I recognize that chocolate cheesecake right now is not itself desirable. It's not worthy of my desire. I wish I didn't desire it. I don't want to desire it. I desire right now to be playing racquetball, to maybe be watching a movie, watching a Netflix show that my wife and I just started. But I recognize that doing this video lecture is more desirable. It has more worth right now than those other things. So I recognize that I desire some things, but other things are themselves more desirable. There's a difference between desirability and actual desire, between something being worthy of desire and something being actually desired by me. And I recognize that within myself. I recognize that the goodness of something is not dependent upon my wanting it or my liking it for the most part. So, for example, here's a mundane example. I recognize that I like chocolate ice cream because it tastes good. It doesn't taste good because I like it. That's a very important distinction. My liking it does not make chocolate ice cream taste good. If that were the case, then all I would have to do is like something and it would taste good. Right? I could like paper and voila, paper tastes good. I could like hair. Sometimes I chew on my hair. I could like hair and voila, hair would taste good. Right? So I recognize a difference between liking something and it's being good. I like it because it's good. My liking doesn't make it good. And so we see a relationship here once again to desirability for the most part. Things are good and my desire is supposed to match that thing. My desires don't make something good. Rather, my desires, we recognize, are supposed to track the goodness of something. So, for example, someone who desires premarital sex, extramarital sex, pornography, those sorts of things, heroin, cocaine, crack, whatever. We recognize that, oh, yes, obviously the person desires it. Nobody denies that the person is desiring that, but what we're saying is those things are not desirable. And so we try to help those persons recraft, restructure their desires, their loves. We experience things as right to do and wrong to do. We know there's a distinction, right? So I might lie to my wife, I don't know, about whether or not I took the trash out. Maybe we're out at dinner, we're having a great time. She remembers that she asked me to take the trash out, had some really smelly stuff in it, and I don't want to spoil our evening, so I lie to her, right? I recognize that it wasn't the right thing to do, but it sort of felt like the advantageous thing. It's advantageous to me to lie. So I recognize that there's a difference between, at least in the small time scale, right? At least in the immediate, I recognize that some things seem advantageous that are not themselves okay for me to do. We experience things as being obligatory, right? In other words, we experience things as, no, this is what I ought to do. I have to do this. I'm required to do this. So maybe I find a wallet, and the wallet has thousands of dollars in it, and it has the person's ID. And I experience, upon discovering this, an obligation to contact that person, even though I don't want to. I may not want to contact the person. And so we'll talk about these things a little bit later when we get to the other book, Glittering Vices. Our conscience, in other words, right? Isa says it does three major things. It informs us of what we ought to do. It moves or pushes us to do good and avoid evil, and it produces guilt when evil is done. We'll talk about the relevance of guilt a little bit later, the importance of guilt. Conscience has three things. Our conscience informs us of what we're supposed to do. It moves or pushes us to do good or avoid evil, and it produces guilt when evil is done. And maybe it also produces a sense of well-being and peace and contentment when we do the right thing. So that's the data from our personal, and there's a lot more that we could say here. That's the data from personal experience. There's a ton more. Here's just another example. Choice making. Making choices, right? When I choose between two competing alternatives, I recognize that most of the time I choose on the basis of things that I value, things that I prefer, things that I find more desirable versus less desirable. So I might choose to exercise rather than go to a movie, and in so choosing, I'm saying to the world, I'm revealing to the world and to myself that at some level, I value exercising at this time in this place more highly than I value going to a movie at this time and at this place. So my choices reveal my values. This is all part of my personal experience of the world. This is all internal to me. Now, we also have a second level of data, and that's what ISA calls interpersonal moral behavior. This is public data, he says, and what's involved in this public data. In other words, this is data that is available for us to observe together. The data here is how we treat one another, how we interact with each other. And so one interesting example that ISA brings up, and I'll talk about this later at length, is the fact that we argue about what's right and what's wrong. Now that's data, right? We engage in arguments. We produce reasons. So I might say abortion is morally wrong. Maybe you say abortion is morally permissible. And I'll try to give you some reasons for thinking that abortion is morally wrong. You'll try to give me some reasons for thinking abortion is morally permissible. What that suggests is that we, in the very process of arguing, debating, I'm not using the word arguing as quarreling, bickering, fighting. I'm using it in the technical sense, the logical sense of giving reasons for what we believe, giving premises for conclusions. So when we engage in argument, we're actually presupposing, we're assuming something about the universe. We're assuming that there's a fact in the universe. Let's say abortion is morally wrong, and that fact, and I'm going to give you some reasons for thinking that that is indeed a fact. So in engaging in moral argument, we're actually assuming moral absolutism. We're denying moral relativism. We don't really argue over whether or not chocolate is better than vanilla, whether or not it tastes better than vanilla. We might do so in a joking way. We all recognize we're just joking. But if people start getting really heated, right, over like their lives depend on whether or not you agree with me that chocolate tastes better than vanilla, we think something's gone wrong. And so we don't do that with morality. We don't do it with abortion. We don't do it with immigration. We don't do it with gun control laws. We don't do it with capital punishment. We don't do it with whether or not there are cases of morally justifiable killing, say in war and self-defense and capital punishment, things like that, in euthanasia. So we engage in moral debate, in moral argument, and that reveals something about what we believe to be the case, that there are facts that exist independently of us, and we're giving reasons for thinking that these are the facts. Abortion is morally wrong, or abortion is morally permissible, or homosexual sexual activity is morally wrong, or homosexual sexual activity is morally permissible. So we take that where we might think, okay, it's a fact that homosexual sexual activity, let's say, is morally wrong or morally right, and I'm going to give you some reasons for thinking, just like we do in science. Someone might think that Darwinian evolution is a fact of the universe, and I'm going to give you some reasons for thinking that this is a fact of the universe. We don't give reasons in that way for chocolate tastes better than vanilla. So the very engaging in moral debate, in moral discussion, in moral argumentation, reveals something about what we think the world is like. It's highly relevant. So, interpersonal, right? The giving of advice to one another. The giving of counsel to one another, the asking for advice, right? Because we think there are facts, we think there are reasons for preferring one course of action to another. And so this type of experience is interpersonal. And here's something that's extremely important to get in our heads here. The data that we've talked about so far, the personal data and the interpersonal data, it is available to us in ways that most scientific data is not available to us. So what's the reason we have for believing there are electrons, or that the atom has this particular structure to it, or that DNA has this particular structure to it? What's the reasons we have for that? Well, it's based on some observation, and it's based on some inference, inductive inference. It's based on looking at microscopes and at telescopes and engaging in various types of indirect observation. Okay. Now, what's the status of the data that we've looked at so far, the personal and interpersonal? It's got an immediacy to it. That data is immediate. Think about it like this. Suppose I go to the doctor today and complain of a toothache. Let's say I tell the doctor I have a toothache and it's excruciating. It's right here. Let's pretend. And let's say they give me a CAT scan, a PET scan, whatever relevant type of scan for my toothache. They do x-rays. I mean, they do the works, and they say, sir, we have no neurological, physiological evidence whatsoever that you have a toothache. You are not in pain right now. Now, I would laugh at them. I'd mock them, and I'd say, no. I'm in pain. Your stupid machines are either not operating properly, you're interpreting the results of the machine improperly, or these are just irrelevant, right? I have a toothache. That's more certain than the data revealed by these fancy instruments. So in other words, there's data that is more immediate, it's more certain, and it's that data that we're supposed to use in engaging in other types of intellectual activity, like science, like nursing, like whatever. So you can't deny that sincere, immediate data in the same way that we could deny, and we have, the structure of the atom. Right? We've changed our understanding of the structure of the atom in radical ways over the last 300 years. So the same is true, right? Look, I experience the giving of advice, the wanting of advice. I experience the pull of my conscience. I experience guilt when I do something that is wrong. Those are things that are immediate, and you're not engaging in you're an ideologue. You're not engaging in genuine intellectual truth seeking if you try to deny that data. That's the basic idea here. Okay. Third level of data is the data of moral language, the data of moral discourse. Now here we're going to focus on moral terms, right? So the basic idea here is, look, we all understand the meaning of moral terms. We understand that, look, abortion is morally wrong, or abortion is morally permissible, or homosexual sexual activity is morally wrong, or homosexual sexual activity is morally permissible. By the way, parentheses, I'm actually going to send you an article on homosexual sexual activity from a philosophical perspective, not a religious one, and you'll have an opportunity to do a reading review on that that's independent of the syllabus. It's an extra opportunity for a reading review. Okay, so look, we understand the meaning of moral terms. We understand Frank is courageous. Cynthia is generous. Mark is honest. Barbara is just and wise, right? These are morally laden, morally loaded terms, and we understand, at least at a surface level, we understand those terms, and that counts of data. The fact that we understand and grasp moral terms, right, that we engage with in our discourse, in our dialogue with each other, right, that fact reveals something important. It's not gibberish. It's not gobbledygook, right? We're not just making stuff up, right? It doesn't look like, it doesn't sound like, at least at an initial level, that we're just inventing stuff. We use moral language in the same way that we use, say, regular empirical language, observational language, right? So we might say, look at that brown tree. And I might say, look at that morally despicable policy, or that morally despicable action. Or look at that morally wonderful, praiseworthy person, right? And so it looks like we're using moral language in the very same way that we use descriptive language or observational language in this way. Both types of language, observational language, empirical language, descriptive language, moral language, evaluative language, all those different types of language seem to be, at least they suggest, that we're attempting to describe reality. We're attempting to track reality. And that's an important piece of data. The fourth type of data that ISA considers, and he's going to consider this one later on as well, we'll go into it in a little bit more detail, is the data of human history. And that data is the wisdom of the past. He calls tradition, this is a nice phrase here, he says tradition is collective moral memory. So tradition is important here. It's not, right, ISA is not saying that tradition is a be-all, end-all, right, but he's saying that tradition is morally relevant. Think of it like this. Some of you are involved in sciences or in applied sciences, like maybe psychology or the social sciences in general, or nursing or things like that. What you're doing is dependent on tradition, right? We've learned lots and lots of things from the past through trial and error, through success and failure. We've built on all sorts of things. Think about the development of physics, the development of chemistry, biology, psychology, the development of mathematics. All of these things have built on the traditions, the accumulation of past knowledge. And so ISA says this is also relevant for our discussion about moral absolutism and moral relativism. And so he gives an interesting argument. Here's the argument he gives. I'm going to give it to you in a step-by-step form. Step 1, morality is the secret of success for a society. Step 2, tradition gives you morality. Step 3, hence tradition gives you the secret of success for a society. Step 1, morality is the secret of success for a society. Step 2, tradition gives you morality. It passes on the wisdom of the ancients. The wisdom of our parents and our grandparents gets passed on to us. I am a wiser person today than I was 15, 20, 30 years ago, for sure. That doesn't imply that I can't learn from a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old. It certainly doesn't imply that. But it does suggest that we need to listen to the past, to past experience, both of our own past experience and the past experiences of others. We do that all the time. We do it in physics, we do it in biology, we do it in chemistry. It's fascinating that we don't do it with our own personal lives. So step 1, morality is the secret of success for our society. Step 2, tradition gives you morality. 3, therefore, tradition gives you the secret of success for a society. And here's the defense of step 1. Step 1 again is morality is the secret of success for a society. And what ISA does here, this is interesting, he says, look at the societies that have lasted the longest in the world. The Mosaic culture society, that's the society that gives rise to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Look at the Confucian society. The Confucian society gives rise to much of the Asian world, not just China, Korea, Japan, much of southeastern China, Cambodia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Laos, have lots and lots and lots of connections to a Confucian sort of paradigm and way of thinking. These types of societies have lasted for thousands upon thousands of years. In India, we have a Hindu society that is based on various religious texts and moral principles. These societies have lasted the longest, and ISA says, in part because they're rooted in a kind of moral absolutism, these universal moral rules. Now, they may be wrong about some of those moral rules. That's not the major point. The major point isn't that they're completely right about their morality. Of course, there's going to be some mistakes in their moral positions. But overall, they believe they can be mistaken. Right? And you can't believe that you can be mistaken about morality if you don't think there's such a thing as morality that exists independently of you. If morality is just based on our own beliefs, desires, and preferences, then I can't be mistaken about it. If I believe it, it's true. If I desire it, it's good. That's all there is to it, if moral relativism is true. So having this idea that there is a morality that exists independently of us and we're supposed to discover it, ISA thinks that that's a centerpiece in these very successful societies that have existed for thousands of years. Okay, we're just about done. Here now I want to present the overall argument of the entire interview. Interview 4, here's the main argument. I'm going to call this the argument from data to moral absolutism. So we're going to abstract away from the details. Step 1. The first and foundational moral experience, that is the data, the first and foundational moral experience we have is absolutistic, right? We experience the world as sort of being, there are certain actions that are morally okay, and there are certain actions that are just never permissible. Rape is wrong. It's never permissible. Torture is wrong, or genocide is wrong. It's never permissible. No matter what, it's never okay to attempt to wipe out an entire people group based on race or ethnicity or religion or something like that. So the first and foundational moral experience we have, the data of personal experience and interpersonal experience, that data of moral language is absolutistic. It points towards absolute moral absolutism. That's step 1. Step 2, any theory that denies the immediate data of moral experience is false. Step 2, any theory that denies the immediate data of moral experience is false. And so the idea here is that if your theory suggests that this data shouldn't be taken into consideration, or it can't explain the data, right? It sort of rules that data sort of stays in the garbage. It can't be incorporated into the theory, then that's a bad theory. And if you've got another theory that can incorporate that data, then that's a much better theory. That's the idea behind step number 2. Step number 3, moral relativism denies the immediate data of moral experience. It denies this data that we've just looked at, those 4 levels of data. Step 3, moral relativism denies the immediate data of moral experience. 4, therefore, moral relativism is false. So the idea here is that when we really pay attention to the data points to moral absolutism. This is the first argument we've been given by Isa to think that moral absolutism is true. We'll look at this argument and some more arguments in detail later. That's enough for today.